Hello everybody, today I'll be covering Chapter 1 in the AMSCO United States Government and Politics AP Edition book. Uh, this chapter is focusing on the Constitution and what are the components of the Constitution, how did we create the Constitution, and what influenced the writers or the founding fathers to write this document. So first we need to do an overview and define the Constitution. So the Constitution is a document that provides the guidelines of the national government, and what it does is it defines the governing principles, national offices, functions, limitations of government. So it also states that there's three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. That there is something called federalism, which is the next chapter that I already covered, and the relationship among the states and the federal government, and there's a certain amendment process to alter the document. And of course, without the Constitution would not be complete without the Bill of Rights, which was added in 1791 to protect individual rights. Now we will learn about the influences and the Enlightenment on the writing of the Constitution. So originally, the inspiration for the American Revolution came from the Enlightenment era, where the colonists argued that they were given natural God-given rights and the social contract by John Locke. John Locke's social contract said that if a government violates the compact between the state and the governed, the people can take that power back. And this particularly happened after the 7 Years' War, where pretty much the British government's telling the colonies that they should pay all these hefty taxes and that they didn't have to pay before, and house their troops and sorts. And pretty much they did not like it whatsoever, and so they decided to have a revolution, and they eventually won the war. So that's how America was created. And now we will move on to more Enlightenment influence, and we'll just be defining some very important concepts. So you have to understand natural law. This idea of people are born with rights that cannot be taken away. The right to be happy, the right to speak, freedom of speech. This is very important. One example of natural law would be the right of speech and to practice their own religion, and the right to property, which just means people can own their own property. Then Locke argued that the people could rebel once the rule of the king did not respect the public's will or the consent of the governed, which is the ideas presented here. And this idea is also known as popular sovereignty, where the people is the ultimate ruling authority, and the government officials are there and exist to carry out the laws. Now we have the separation of powers. This idea in the Constitution and Enlightenment states that there's going to be one large federal government, but there's going to be consisted of multiple other branches, which is Montesquieu's idea. It has an executive, legislative, and judicial branch, so no part of the government has too much power and becomes tyrannical. Now, finally, we get to republicanism. It's a political ideology founded upon Enlightenment ideas such as natural rights, popular sovereignty, separation of powers, and the social contract that supported a republic form of government, not a democracy. These are two completely different things. And now we will get into the three kinds of representative democracies. Participatory democracy is a direct participation in government affairs and public life through voting for a nation's citizens. One example would be ancient Athens, where people voted on everyday affairs. They counted the rocks. People had a yes rock and a no rock. And, for example, they wrote yes or no like on a ballot. And then they, let's say, they want to outlaw chocolate. And 51% of Athens says yes. They write it on their rock or their paper, and they give it to the ballot, whoever is counting the ballot in the government. And then another 49% says, no, we don't want to outlaw chocolate. That's absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't matter. The 51% won. So that'd be one example of direct participation in government affairs. It's a very extreme example, but it's just to get the idea. Next is pluralist democracy, which is non-government interest groups such as labor unions or gun advocates attempt to influence government and political decision making. And finally, we have the elite government, where elected representatives make decisions and represent the people who elected them. People of resources and influence dominate the government. This is primarily seen in industrial America before the Progressive Era, where there was a lot of business and corruption. And now we're going to the Declaration of Independence. This document was made to summarize the colonists' views to justify the break and split from Britain, and they declared independence from Britain. Most important writers include Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. And this eventually leads up to them winning the war, the colonists, and creating America. And we will get to the Articles of Confederation, which is the next step in understanding how we got to the Constitution. So the Articles of Confederation is like a rough draft of what our government should be. No one really knew how to make a government exactly. Since America was the first Enlightenment Influence revolution, no one really knew how to make a country out of nothing. They just won a war. So what they did, they made the Articles of Confederation, which was a series of statements that defined an initial national government and redefined the former colonies as states. This was the first document in creating government for America. So it was not the Constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation. And another important idea is to understand is extradition, where states were expected to return fugitives to states where they had committed crimes from. This was applied to runaway slaves. This is kind of to respect this idea of, hey, we're all working together. You can't be a criminal in one state and not be a criminal in another. They're all still criminals, and you have to return them to their rightful state. And now we have to understand why the Articles failed. So the first issue was that Congress couldn't tax directly. They needed money, and they just couldn't get it, as the Articles of Confederation didn't say that Congress could tax directly. Then there was no national currency and court system. How are people going to determine whether or not laws are right and wrong? Law cases, where's the money coming from? Where's the national currency? Every state has their own national currency. What if one person didn't want to use New York's money? They wanted to use Pennsylvania money and New Jersey's money, but they don't think New York's money is valid. This is a problem when you have this entire country that needs to trade with each other. Now, Congress couldn't also regulate interstate commerce. Still, this is a big problem. They can't regulate trade among their own colonies and states. Not colonies, states. So, how is someone going to trade 1 bushel of wheat from New York to Pennsylvania? And how they get it there, and how Congress is going to do inspections, requirements, national requirements, it's not going to be there, which is definitely a big problem for a nation economically. Next, Congress could not raise and maintain an army. This is a big issue, as they just won a war. What are they going to do if, let's say, Spain declared war on America? And they eventually did, later in American history. But if Spain declared a war right after they won the War of Britain, what are they going to do? They really couldn't. And then also there are strict requirements to enact national law, as 9 states had to agree to make national law, but to change the system government required unanimous agreement. This is absolutely insane. How can you get so many people from diverse states, from the South, North, Mid-Atlantic states, and New England, to all agree to change one part of government? It just doesn't add up. These were extremely big problems with the Articles of Confederation, and eventually there was Shays' Rebellion as well, which challenged the Articles of Confederation, as it was needed to stop rebellions, and the leaders of and founding fathers of the United States realized the government needs to be revised. So the Constitutional Convention happens, and we're going to have James Madison, the father of the Constitution, heavily influencing creating the plan for this new government, and that document would be the Constitution. And so they talk about all these plans. First is the Virginia Plan, and it had three branches: the bicameral legislature, two-house legislature, supremacy of national government, the Supremacy Clause, and the separation of powers. This is a very good plan, but then New Jersey argues that there needs to be sovereignty of states. There needs to be limited defined powers of the natural legislature, and that we want equal representation in Congress. But the thing is, there's this big problem now of, should we use population in Congress, or should we use equal representation in Congress for states? Now there's a great compromise that just says, why not do both? So the members of the House of Representatives are apportioned by the population. That means that, so Congress has two parts to it: the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Senate consists of 2 senators from our 50 states, so there's 100 senators overall. This is equal representation for each state. While the House of Representatives is apportioned and made by the population of each state, so it could vary state to state how many representatives they have because of the population size. Next, we have the Three-Fifths Compromise and importation of slaves. So only every 3 of 5 slaves would be counted for the purpose of representation in the House of Representatives. This is important to know in the historical context because there was slaves during this period of time. They were not people, so but people thought they were sort of people, but not really, because they wanted more representation in the House of Representatives. That was the only reason why, and so they had that compromise instead. And now Congress could not stop the importation of slaves for 20 years after this document was ratified. Finally, we get to the Electoral College, and the states decide how their electors are chosen. With each state having the same number of electors, they had representatives in Congress. So we'll be moving on to the next idea, the proposed constitutional structure. So first, there's a preamble, or the mission statement. We all know the Constitution begins with "We the people," which outlined the purpose of the new government, such as establishing justice and providing for a common defense for the nation. Next, the plan for the government included 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Each of these 3 branches have unique powers, and each are able to block the other from getting too much powers. This idea is the separation of powers, and also includes the checks and balances. Next, we have the policy, the laws the government creates, and the manner in which they are carried out. This is just simply the definition of policy. And the lawmaking process, according to the founding fathers and writers of the Constitution, states it like so. Congress writes and passes most of the laws. The President and administrative agencies carry out and enforce those laws. And eventually, the Supreme Court determines the constitutionality, but that's called judicial review, but doesn't happen until later on in the development of the United States history. Now we will go on to the Constitution. So here are some enumerated powers that the government has. The federal government can tax, they can borrow money, they can raise an army, create a postal system, address piracy over the seas, and define immigration and natural process to coming into the country and becoming a citizen. Now here's some clauses. First is the Commerce Clause, which is Congress can regulate commerce among the states and other nations. Next is the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause, which grants government implicit powers to assure Congress some flexibility in legislating. This allows for the government to kind of have more power where it's not stated, but not exactly too much, and I covered this in the last video as well in better detail. Now we have the Full Faith and Credit Clause, requires states to be open about their laws and encourages states to respect other state laws. This is pretty simple, as let's say I have a job in Pennsylvania as a Carvel worker. This is a public record. And if I go into New York, they have to respect the fact that I'm already a Carvel worker in Pennsylvania. And finally, we have the Supremacy Clause. All states must adhere to the Constitution, as demonstrated by this little cartoon with the states saluting the Constitution as their leader, as they all have to recognize its superiority. Next, we have the Articles of the Constitution. Article 1 defines the legislative branch. Article 2 defines the executive branch. Article 3 defines the judiciary branch. Article 4 defines relations among states, and also known as federalism. Article 5 describes the amendment process to add on amendments to the Constitution. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, saying that the federal government is supreme and all national law is supreme over states, which is also known as national supremacy. And Article 7 describes the ratification process to add on, similar to the amendment process, to ratify the document itself. And now we get to ratification. So there was two groups of people in colonial America against ratification and for ratification. So the against group were a few men who refused to sign the Constitution, as they're like, there's no Bill of Rights. And this causes a debate. It was led by George Mason and Patrick Henry. They feared that possible abuse would happen under the Constitution, similar to Britain's treatment of the colonists. And it was a legitimate fear, as they want to know what rights do the people have, and that would be protected no matter what. While the for ratification group said that they wanted to stop possible fears that the new government would abuse their power. So what they did was they wrote the Federalist Papers. Sometimes they would call it under the name Publius. And these were essays that argued for the ratification of the Constitution. While on the other side there was a party in the group against ratification, with Brutus. The essays arguing against the ratification of the Constitution. And now we finally get to the Bill of Rights. So the rights in the original Constitution, there's 5 of them to remember. There's no religious test to hold federal office, like you don't have to be a certain Christian sect, such as Protestant, Catholic, or some sort, or be a Jewish, Catholic, doesn't matter. Second, there's a right to jury trials in criminal cases. Third, Congress can't, or no states can pass a bill of attainder. Fourth, neither Congress nor the states can pass ex post facto laws. Fifth, Congress cannot suspend habeas corpus rights except in wartime. And so we have the father of the Constitution, James Madison, the strong proponent of the Bill of Rights. He didn't feel as if it was necessary to list these rights, because he just didn't think they'd be taken away in the future. But eventually he realized, and the Congress were concerned about the rights, the amendments, and that evolved into the Bill of Rights in 1791. And also, this is another fact, that the Bill of Rights was added because they needed full ratification. They need to add the Bill of Rights so to get more votes to make sure the Constitution is ratified. Now we're going to get to the amendments of the Bill of Rights. So Amendment 1 describes the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and protesting. Amendment number 2 describes the right to bear arms, the now controversial one. Amendment 3 is no quartering of troops. There cannot be a soldier stationed inside your home. This is something that the colonists did not like, so they wrote in the Bill of Rights. And Amendment 4 describes no unreasonable searches or seizures. This means that police officers and people need a warrant to go into your home and search you. Amendment 5 describes indictment. There is supposed to be no double jeopardy, protection against incrimination, and there's due process of law. And no double jeopardy means that you can't be charged for the same crime twice, which sometimes can be really ridiculous, but let's say if you murder someone twice and somehow you got the first way, you got away with it. The second time you couldn't be tried for it. It's a strange one, but there's a more just reason of why it's there. Now we have Amendment 6. It's a speedy public trial by jury of peers. There's cross-examination and right to having a defense counsel. Now, Amendment number 7, there's lawsuits and juries related in this amendment. Moving on to Amendment number 8, there's no cruel or unusual punishments and no excessive fines. Amendment number 9 and number 10 are important to federalism, as number 9 discusses listing rights in the Constitution doesn't deny others' rights, which means the people have the rights that are not exactly expressed in the Constitution. And in Amendment 10, that the states have delegated and reserved powers that exactly aren't expressed to the federal government. One of them examples would be over education in schools and marriage records. Now we need to get to learn the constitutional principles. So here's an overview of what the principles are going to look like. We need to understand representative republic and limited government, separation of powers and checks and balances, federalism, flexibility, and limited government once again. So first we need to understand that our country is a democratic republic. And in this republic, also known as a representative republic, a collection of sovereign states are gathered for the national interest, national needs, and national defense of this overall nation. And that the only popular elections in the original Constitution were for House members that happened every 2 years. Moving on to the separation of powers, we have these three branches that were made to equally distribute power to make sure that no branch had too much power. Legislature branch is the most numerous and representative branch, which makes public's will become public policy. It's the most influential branch that is heavily influenced by the public, the people of the United States. Then we have the executive branch, which is mainly the president and the bureaucracies within the executive branch, where the president enforces the law and it carries out Congress's policies. Next, we have the Supreme and Federal Courts, which is the judicial branch, where they hear disputes and interpret laws and their application. Members of the Supreme Courts are approved by the Senate, but are initially appointed by the President. Moving on to checks and balances. So first we need to understand that the limiting powers each branch can use on the other are known as checks and balances. A veto is the president's rejection of a bill that Congress wants to pass. Like the president could just say, no, I don't want to sign it into law. He could just veto it. And then the president also has a pocket veto, which means the president can refuse to sign the bill at the end of a legislative session, which just stops the bill completely. Now there's the advice and consent, which is the sensibility to have formal approval on presidential appointments, such as the Supreme Court members. Now there's impeachment, which is an accusation or an indictment of wrongdoing. The House can impeach a federal judge, president, or any other official of wrongdoing. This means, let's say, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton was accused of treason, so they decided to impeach him and have an indictment against him. This is one example of impeachment. And now we also have the system of checks and balances, which includes impeachment based on the rule of law. You have judicial review, the ability of the judicial branch or courts to declare an act of the legislature being unconstitutional when deciding on a case. So this means that the Supreme Court can pretty much say and vote on amongst, they need a majority though, just saying oh, this law is not constitutional, and they will be ruled constitutional and no longer be in effect. Now, getting to federalism, flexibility, national supremacy, and limited government. Federalism is the balance of power among central national authority and state or regional authorities, which assures a limited government. Next, we have flexibility, which means the amendment process, that the Constitution and government from 200 years ago is not the same government we have now. There's been a lot of more than just 10 amendments, as we added more than 10. There's over 20 amendments right now. And now we also have national supremacy, which is a supremacy clause also saying that, once again, that in Article 6, the federal government's authority is the law of the land, and Congress cannot claim national supremacy on distinctly reserved powers. Finally, we have limited government, which includes slow lawmaking processes and the Bill of Rights. So the constitutional framers wanted the lawmaking process to be slow, for the branches to discuss, debate, and rewrite legislation before it is fully passed. The Bill of Rights limits the government from infringing on natural rights, and that's really important to know, as we need order, and we don't want too much power to go to government to become too tyrannical, as we'll have another revolution again. Moving on to the branches of government. First, we're going to cover the legislative branch. The legislative branch includes a bicameral legislature, which means that there's two parts of the legislature. There's two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So senators have 100 members. Each state has 2 senators. The House of Representatives has 435 representatives, which includes a state's number of representatives dependent on their population. Congress makes the nation's laws. They determine how to fund the government and shape the nation's foreign policy. Congress also has many employees that are just not senators or representatives that help write the bills, research the data, listen to citizens in each district, and inform voters about the acts their Congress member has done. Next is the executive branch. This primarily deals with the president and his executive departments and agencies. So the president serves a 4-year term and can only serve 2 full terms. This happened since the 22nd Amendment was added. These are the requirements to become president. There's obviously a little bit more, like you have to be 35 years old minimum, but this is just an outline of what requirements can exist. And next we have a large executive branch departments and agencies that oversee parts of the government, such as the military, and they govern entire national industries. One example would be the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates radio, television broadcasts, and internet communications. Then checks and balances also exist, where Congress creates the bureaucratic agencies of the executive government, checks on their performance, and determines their funding, and sometimes reshapes their policy and missions. Finally, we have the judicial branch. Judicial review is a major step in determining and finalizing law. The Supreme Court and lower courts use judicial review to protect liberties that properly create policy, also used for creating the checking the legislature, and also checking the executive or state actions to shape overall policy. This is mainly to uphold the rights listed in the Bill of Rights, and also to see if the government's not overstepping their territory in the Constitution. And now we need a 5 out of 9 majority in the Supreme Court to overturn a law. So at least 5 of the 9 justices who serve today must agree on a majority opinion for a decision to uphold or overturn a law. And now we get to 2 vocab words: concurring opinions and dissenting opinions. concurring opinions in the judicial branch is where justices agree with the majority opinion, but have differing or additional reasons for reaching that conclusion. Dissenting opinions is when when justices disagree with the majority opinion. This is happens when there's a conflict within the Supreme Court. Two different scenarios. The concurring opinions, say most of them agree, but they have different reasons why they agree on that opinion. And then the second one of the dissenting opinions is when some justices don't outright agree with the majority opinion. So let's say there's a 5-4. This is a vote, and this is a dissenting opinion from the Supreme Court. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Good luck on the test. Sorry for the late upload.